Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and I know I've been away for a few weeks between babysitting my daughter, who had no camp, getting ready for back to school, having relatives from out of town visiting, just regular work commitments, my wedding anniversary, a holiday, and conveniently my boiler exploding in my basement, which led to a couple of days of cleanup. So it's been eventful on my end, but apologies for not getting out all those episodes. I had so many good intentions to get so many episodes out. But I have been watching some movies and some series along the way and trying to come up with a way to cover many of these topics at once. And this is going to be a very busy month. Between September and October, this is the launch of the new TV season. And a lot of films have just premiered at film festivals. There will be a film festival near my hometown in Montclair, New Jersey, that I will probably be attending and covering here in some way. So many topics to come in the upcoming months. But to keep things relatively focused for this return episode for me, I want to talk about the number one movie in the land, Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. I'll be reviewing that movie. No spoilers, I don't think. I'm going to get into any spoilers here, by the way. This is really not a movie you can spoil. And that'll be a relatively short review, followed by a career retrospective of the career of Tim Burton. A very long and a very prolific career. And Beetlejuice Beetlejuice just premiered this past weekend with over $100 million in the US. I'll still be having a summer box office recap for anybody who's curious about that. I've started to record it already. And this is the beginning of the fall season rather than the summer itself. But I had, just to have my box office prognostication cap on, I had predicted the film would open with a little over $100 million. It topped $110 million in the US. But surprisingly is tracking much less than I thought. I thought the appeal would be, let's say, 30 or 40% larger in the US. So maybe a final box office in the US around 300 and overseas at least 200. Looks like we are going to top that $300 million gross in the US, but not even get close to 200 overseas. Which is to say that Tim Burton in general, and we'll get into a recap of his career, has had more of an appeal in the US than he has internationally, which is not to say that he has not had some massive successes globally as well. So to kick things off, a brief review of Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. It's interesting to see Burton coming back to this franchise now 36 years after the original, and really surprising that they had never been able to successfully launch a sequel to this film. Yes, Burton has been very busy for a very long time, but he has had lulls in his career where you could imagine that a Beetlejuice sequel would have rejuvenated his career a little bit, or at least been a better fit given some of those films he produced over that period of time. Like Dark Shadows, for example, a perfect time when he could have been doing this sequel instead. And not dissimilarly, we're going through a 10-year resurrection to Michael Keaton's career, a career that jumped into hyperdrive exactly following Beetlejuice, and then, of course, Batman itself, also with Tim Burton directing. But you can imagine that that career rejuvenation would have come even sooner if there had been a Beetlejuice sequel in the early 2000s, let's say, for example. So surprising it's taken this long, and given that, it's kind of surprising that this is such a messy film. There are so many plots and so many characters in this film. Not only do we have most of the original cast coming together, Winona Ryder is back as Lydia, but Catherine O'Hara is back as Delia. Jeffrey Jones as the father is interestingly absent here from the film, although the character still exists. I won't even get into details of that. He dies and then is in the afterlife. So they entertainingly are able to keep the character in the film without bringing the actor back, who has had some very unsavory criminal accusations in the past decade or so. So look them up on your own if you're curious. And of course, Michael Keaton as Beetlejuice is back. And as Lydia's daughter, we have this generation's most famous scream queen, Jenna Ortega, who worked on Wednesday, the Wednesday Addams Netflix series, hugely successful, with Tim Burton, who directed most of those episodes and also was an executive producer. But that's not all. There is a doomed teen romance subplot, which really feels like something right out of the Wednesday Addams series, or even from something like his adaptation of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. And in many ways, this really feels like Burton is coming back to some of his familiar motifs and some of his design fixations. And in so many ways, it feels like a summation of his career. And maybe that is why it feels so convoluted in its plotting and so many side stories, which do all come together at the end. So I do give the film credit for really going on in 10 different directions at the same time. We're introduced to Lydia, who is now a celebrity medium on TV. We very early on find this character, played by Monica Bellucci, Tim Burton's latest stunning very much of a type, by the way, latest girlfriend, which he does normally cast in his films, by the way. It's kind of a tradition with him as well, who has resurrected herself and reassembled herself in a very entertaining scene very early in the film. But how does this tie in with the rest of the plot of the film? It honestly does not for a very, very long time. And there are many side stories. There is this tension between Lydia and her daughter, the Jenna Ortega character, because she thinks her mother's a fraud. Her mom has made a career, a very successful career, of being able to communicate with the dead, but yet can't communicate with her father, who died on some Amazonian expedition. And yet Lydia's never been able to communicate with him. Lydia is dating her producer, played by Justin Theroux. Very entertaining, but very inconsequential. There is a detective in this noirish sideline story investigating the Monica Bellucci character, who is a soul sucker, so can kill the actual dead. So they are dead, that he says. And because she had been romantically involved with Beetlejuice in the past, this leads him to investigate Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice, meanwhile, is getting involved with what's happening in the land of the living, like he did in the original film. And if this seems like a lot of plots, all introduced very early on, those aren't really spoilers, by the way. This is all introduced within the first few minutes of the film. It really is. This script is all over the place. This isn't the first time that Burton has done this. And part of the reason that this feels really like a summation of his career is in that way as well. I've heard people complain that this is a very convoluted plot, but as if Mars Attack, which was a flop at the time, but has been reclaimed as a bit of a masterpiece. I disagree. We'll get into the ranking of his films later on. But think about how many characters and how many storylines are there, all competing for attention, jumping from one part of the planet to another. Compared to that, this is very streamlined. But that's not the only case as well. A film that I very much do like, and I think was underappreciated, actually despised in the day, is the Batman Returns sequel. And I absolutely love that film, primarily because of the incredibly charged chemistry between Michael Keaton and Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman character. But that is not a neat script at all. We have Penguin there too, oftentimes just barely intersecting with the main plot. And of course, Christopher Walken's evil billionaire character, which once again is just another villain, yet another villain in a film full of villains. Which is to say that having a messy script is not necessarily unique to this new Beetlejuice film. And to be honest, it does all tie together at the end. A lot of these characters who are honestly throwaway by the time we get to the end, literally in some points, these whole entire storylines are tossed away like with a punchline, and very entertainingly, by the way, but still seems unnecessary by the end of the film, which is a pretty tight hour 45, well under 2 hours. So slightly longer than Beetlejuice. But Beetlejuice had a very simple plot when you consider it now, especially compared to this one. And even with all of those additional plots, it's as if you had streamlined this storyline down to only one of these main plot lines. This film would not have even filled out anywhere near 1.5 hours. Perhaps that's why they've added all these other tangential characters. But in the end, none of this really matters. This is fan service. Do you love Burton's career in general? Do you love Beetlejuice? Did you grow up watching Beetlejuice? You will be very happy with this. Is there any kind of character development? Yes, there is. And Jenna Ortega's character, Astrid, is well fleshed out here. But as I mentioned, this is really cobbling together a bunch of fixations of Tim Burton's. So, of course, we have the sequel. We have the Beetlejuice character back again. We have a beautiful and honestly inconsequential but very funny extended homage to Black Sabbath, not the musicians, the movie from Mario Bava, this black and white in Italian sequence of the film, which is there only for him to pay homage to black and white horror films, something that he's done in the past, of course. And it almost feels like a capstone to a career. Burton has mentioned that he was completely burned out on making Hollywood movies after the failure of Dumbo, which actually made some money. We'll get into that once again in the breakdown, in the career breakdown. But more so the requirements from Disney, and he just wasn't passionate about the material. And it feels like here, the most positive thing I could say about the film is that it really does feel like he is reclaiming what he enjoyed about the films before. And some of that is just throwing in a character because she's his girlfriend and she looks great, or having an homage to Italian horror movies because he loves those horror movies. So all that is to say that the more vested you are in the whole entire Tim Burton persona and his career and his aesthetics, obviously, the more you're going to enjoy this. If you're a huge Beetlejuice fan, unlike Beetlejuice, which I'll get into a mini review of that when we cover his career. Impressed me in a rewatch now at how efficient it is at the world building, at introducing us to this world. You honestly could go into this film and maybe just watch it, like if you're just a Jenna Ortega fan, and be like, wow, that was weird and pretty funny, and have no idea what the rules of this world are. It's just cobbled together skits. And it could still be very entertaining in that way. But it really doesn't feel like this is an entry point for folks. It really feels like this is more fan service for Burton's career in general, and of course, specifically the Beetlejuice film itself, which I guess has crossed over in the generations to become a full-on cult hit, but a huge cult hit at that. So all of these individual side plot lines are entertaining. The stakes are well defined. It all is driving towards a zany wedding ceremony, even bigger. That's one thing that's very much the case here in this film. This is massive filmmaking compared to the first Beetlejuice film. And another compliment I'll pay to all of this is that he obviously is using a lot of CGI, but when we get to the career breakdown, I'm going to have a delineation point where I started to lose interest in his projects, and the films that worked for me versus the ones that did not almost always had this over-reliance on CGI. In a way, maybe he needed to be a little constrained. It is the tactile nature of Beetlejuice, and even Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and even Batman, which is a huge film at the time, a huge, huge film. But those are sets for the most part that they're interacting on with very limited special effects. I mean, the Batwing is a model, right? So there is a tactile nature to the best of his films. And here we have a lot of CGI, but there also feels a lot of sets, a lot of design, practical design. And the blend is very good here, I think. It feels like a real place, a bizarro world, of course, that he's inhabiting, but it feels more tactile and real than something, for example, once again, Miss Peregrine's School for Peculiar Children. So once again, I'm not even going to bother spoiling this. It's a bunch of gags strung together. Most of them are very funny. The design work is beautiful. The world building is very nice. The script is a complete mess, but it does come together at the end. And if you're a Tim Burton fan, you're going to like this. If you're a Beetlejuice fan, you're going to like this. Maybe even like it a lot. If you hate Beetlejuice, if you have no interest in the Tim Burton project in general, you can probably avoid this. You probably won't hate it, but you're probably not going to get much out of it either. Wait until you can rent it at home if you're on the fence. All right, so let's kick off the Tim Burton career retrospective. Tim Burton, believe it or not, grew up in California, Burbank, right with production studios practically in his backyard. Despite the fact that he always felt like an outsider and he was always into art and drawing, he actually was an athlete in high school, but started doing a lot of animation work, stop motion animation. He actually went to the California Institute of the Arts, where he started to make stop motion animations and got him a lot of attention. As a matter of fact, got him a position as a animator inside of the Walt Disney Corporation. He actually did a lot of storyboarding and concept art for some of these big early 80s Disney movies. This was actually when Disney was kind of in the dumps, by the way. So most of these films were flops, but he got a lot of practical experience working on films like The Fox and the Hound, Tron, and The Black Cauldron. Once again, all flops at the time. And they really couldn't find a place for his sensibility. He definitely had this outsider sensibility. But as I mentioned, Disney was kind of struggling at this moment with the traditional Disney aesthetics and the cartoons they were producing. And they gave him a little bit of money to make a short film called Vincent, which was actually narrated by Vincent Price. And this black and white stop motion animation, interestingly, shows a lot of the motifs that are going to be in his entire career. What is kind of fascinating about Burton's aesthetic is that he loved the old black and white horror films like Frankenstein, one of his favorite films, but also throughout the 1950s and 60s, as I mentioned with the Beetlejuice review, he also loved these early Italian horror films from that era as well. So he was combining this black and white aesthetic, but very much with the whimsy of Disney. So which of course was in Burbank, right in his backyard. So it's as if these aesthetics got blended together, these sensibilities. He made an even longer short film called Frankenweenie, eventually would become a feature film years later, and had a recognizable cast, including Shelley Duvall. So a lot of people were buzzing about him as what is going to be his first directing project. Simultaneously, Paul Rubens had auditioned for the revamped Saturday Night Live. This was in 1981, the year that Saturday Night Live was getting rid of their original cast, churning through the whole thing. This is when they thought Saturday Night Live was going to die after the original cast members, Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, etc., left. But of course, struck pay dirt with Eddie Murphy, Joe Piscopo, and that whole cast of folks. And Paul Reubens auditioned, and he almost made the cut, and then when he didn't, he almost quit the business. But instead, he took one of his characters, his Pee Wee Herman character, and started doing an off-Broadway, the equivalent in off-Broadway in Los Angeles version of this show, as if it was this demented kid show. He had seen Frankenweenie, like people on Insiders were seeing this, and by the way, Warner Brothers wanted to make the Pee Wee Herman show into a movie. They had recorded it at one point, put it on late night against Saturday Night Live on HBO, used to have a late night comedy block against SNL, and they showed the Pee Wee Herman show there in one of those slots, and it was very successful for HBO. So Warner Brothers was like, hey, we'll give you $5 million, turn this into a movie. And Paul Reubens went to Tim Burton. It was on the short list of possible directors, and he really liked Frankenweenie, and they just thought they would be simpatico, and it turned out to be a match made in heaven. So believe it or not, for this career retrospective, it's the first time I have ever seen Pee-wee's Big Adventure all the way through. I had never seen this film all the way through. I was in middle school, perhaps, maybe even younger, when this came out. I remember people imitating the dance in my grammar school, middle school, whatever I was at that time, grammar school. But I did not see the film. And this was the first year I had moved to the suburbs. So it was a summer where I had seen so many movies in the movie theater, but for whatever reason, not that one. And a few things that I come away with from having seen this for the first time. First of all, this movie's really, really funny. I laughed so much watching this movie. Second revelation for me was that I knew so many of these skits. So many of these things have just become ingrained in the culture that I was shocked to see that I have not seen this film all the way through, but pretty much knew almost everything that happens in it, even how you get from one scene to the next. And that's really key. By the way, going back to Beetlejuice, this is another bit of a retrospective that's being implemented there. It is very much like a review. It is just a bunch of skits tied together, one after the other. And that's my next revelation in all of this. Obviously, from seeing the film itself, the goal of the film was to take Paul Reubens' skits and tie them together into a film. And Burton does such a great job with this. I mean, I cannot compliment him enough. It sounds like it's easy. Hey, you just put the camera on and he does his stuff. That's not true at all. He's paying off jokes. He's seeding those jokes 3, 4, 5 scenes earlier and then paying them off visually later on. It's really clever stuff. Obviously, it's probably in the script when Reubens was coming up with these skits, but being able to pull that off visually is so adept for someone who's making their first feature film is really impressive work for me. Like having seen this, I neglected this as it's just a kid's film, whatever. I'll get around to it someday. And I was really impressed by Burton's work here for sure. Oh, next revelation is I had never seen this film before, but my daughter, of course, like every child, loves SpongeBob SquarePants, especially those early seasons of SpongeBob. She's seen the first 2 or 3 seasons of that show over and over again. The other ones she dabbles in, but those first 2 or 3 seasons in constant rotation, especially when she was even younger than she is now. And so many of the jokes from SpongeBob are right out of Pee Wee Herman. So, of course, SpongeBob is basically Pee Wee Herman, and I had never realized that until now. Yet another revelation for me. So, definitely a very entertaining film. Definitely recommend this one, especially if you're curious at all about Tim Burton's starting point. There are some inappropriate jokes here, by the way, that I completely would not have gotten earlier. So you can probably watch this with your kids. Your kids will probably love this. Pee-wee's full of imagination, always inventing new things, his contraptions for getting up in the morning, and very SpongeBob. I think if your kids love SpongeBob, they will love Pee Wee Herman. And like I said, there are some jokes you're like, oh, wow, wouldn't have caught that. But they're all written that way, in a way that you probably would not have caught it, or they definitely will not catch it. So I do recommend this as family viewing if you're curious to give it a look. This film was an enormous success. It ended up costing $8 million. This is according to Wikipedia, so I've heard different budgets on this, but let's say $8 million. It made over $40 million in the US. Back in the 80s, you didn't really know what the overseas numbers were. I'm presuming that overseas numbers were pretty small compared to its US numbers because this was a sleeper. No one was expecting this thing to become a blockbuster. Became a massive hit once it turned out on cable. Once it came out on cable and in ancillaries. And of course, launched a TV series that ran for years. So everybody made a lot of money off of this Pee Wee Herman film. So of course, Tim Burton was a hot commodity here at this point. He was offered some pretty terrible comedy scripts. One of them was Hot to Trot with Bobcat Goldthwait, which has a 0% Rotten Tomato score. So maybe Burton could have elevated that material, but he probably dodged a bullet by not making some of these films that were offered to him. Pee-wee's Big Adventure came out in 85, and years went by without him putting out a film. Warner Brothers was like, what do you want to make? What do you want to make? There was one film in development that he definitely wanted to make, and that film was Batman. And Warner Brothers was like, we are not giving you Batman. That is not going to happen. But he kept developing it, and he had some sketches. He had done storyboarding for Disney, remember? So he had storyboarded. He did his own stop motion animation. So he had done some clay figurines. So it was very, very well developed. So at first, Warner Brothers was like, we're not going to give you this. You don't have the experience. Then they saw his design work, and they're like, I don't know. We don't know if we want a goth Batman. But then over time, they're like looking at his design work, like, man, this is really well fleshed out. He's really thought about everything. Maybe we can make this work. But they were still not certain. They weren't really confident about this. And they were still trying to go in a more generic direction with Batman. Now, remember, Warner Brothers had 10 years prior, 10 years, they had the massive worldwide phenomena of the first Superman film, the Christopher Reeve film. Those films had progressively become less successful at the box office. Superman 4 had been a complete fiasco. And in general, comic book movies were a dud. But they had this Batman character, which was so famous, they had to at least give it a shot. So they were desperately trying to get this off the ground. And they had trepidations about Burton, who'd been developing this thing for years. In the meantime, Burton had been doing some TV directing. He directed an episode of the rebooted Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And the script was written by the same folks who ended up writing a script called Beetlejuice, about basically the opposite of Poltergeist, a ghost that exorcises humans from your haunted house. The script was darker. Beetlejuice was more of a demonic and trickster type character. He wanted to have sex with the Lydia character. All these things not really correct for a PG-rated film. So Burton worked with these writers on the script, massaged the material into a more goofy, bringing in some of that high energy, visual inventiveness and mousetrap-like contraptions from his experience with Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And when Warner Brothers saw the finished product, which they wanted to keep him on the hook. They were interested in his Batman take. They didn't want to throw everything away. They had a huge success with the previous film. They offered him a pretty big budget, $15 million. At the time, for a comedy, a supernatural comedy, that's a pretty big budget. Adjusted for inflation, that's like a $40, $50 million budget. For a supernatural comedy, you had Ghostbusters, which definitely was a reason that I'm certain people were looking for the next Ghostbusters, the next Poltergeist, two massively successful films. So $15 million seemed like a reasonable amount of money. They had made at least that much on Pee-wee's Big Adventure. They were willing to take the risk here and keep him around in case he came up with any other interesting ideas. But when they saw the finished product, they were like, this thing is going to be a disaster. But that's not what happened at all. The film came out and was a huge hit, making $75 million in the US. That in today's money, once again, adjusting for inflation, you're talking about well over $200 million, way more than they expected to make off this thing. That's just in the United States. That doesn't include ancillaries. That doesn't include the fact that it became a very successful cartoon show afterwards as well. So once again, everybody made a lot of money on this, and Burton was ascendant once again. I rewatched this probably for the first time since I've seen it on cable, who knows, 30 some odd years ago, 35 years ago. I did not see this in the theaters. And I was really impressed with it in the fact that the world building is really good. Michael Keaton is so funny in the role. Very underused. I was shocked to see that you basically don't even see Beetlejuice. I mean, I think you see him on TV in an advertisement for a few seconds. He's looming, like we know he's coming. We know he's coming. Very smart way to design this within the script. But it's literally the midpoint of the film, 45, 50 minutes in, when he shows up for the first time. And then he disappears, and then he's back again at the end, of course. But it's like 15, 20 minutes of the film. And obviously, you don't remember that because he's he looms over the entire project. And when Keaton shows up, so funny in the role. And of course, the whole Keaton side of this. So Keaton here, too, emerging as a star. He'd been in the massively popular Mr. Mom, the less successful Gung Ho. And honestly, in my little understanding of him as an actor at this moment, I don't even know why he would have been cast as Beetlejuice. But obviously, a completely iconic character, which is surprising that it still is so relevant in culture because he never reprised the role. So maybe it's because of the cartoon, which lasted for a few years. Maybe it's because Winona Ryder's so young in that original film. became such a huge star. And of course, Catherine O'Hara also being in the Home Alone films. So all these stars had much bigger profiles for the decades to come. And of course, Burton himself becoming one of the most successful directors of his era probably extended the life of this film, which honestly, watching it, it's kind of shocking that it has had kind of the life it has. It's not because it's not a good film, but because it doesn't seem to have that it factor that you would think would be necessary for this type of thing to be a cultural meme for so long. But anyway, back to Burton. Another huge success. Again, people are thinking, this thing's not going to be popular, is it? And of course, it's very popular. So Warner Brothers says, what do you want to do now? And he says, I want to do Batman. And now Warner Brothers starts thinking, all right, look, we had a sleeper hit with Beetlejuice and it made a lot of money. We barely advertised that movie. What if we do like a full court press? We say, he's a visionary. People know who he is now. He's made 2 very popular films, even more popular on home video. And Batman by himself is going to attract a crowd. So let's, and very importantly, by the way, all the other possible options, other development pathways for a Batman film had all fallen apart. So they're like, let's just do the Burton thing. He's pretty much pre-visualized the entire film at this point. And they gave him $40 million, a massive budget at the time, to make this Batman film. They get Jack Nicholson to play the Joker role. Nicholson agrees to it, but takes 10% of the box office and a chunk of the merchandising, supposedly, because of the amazing amount of merchandising on this film. He earned some $100 million on this film, and that is in 1989 money. But of course, this film is a massive, massive success. It comes out in 89, a year full of hugely popular films, and is the biggest of those giant films. It makes $250 million in the US. At the time, had the biggest opening weekend of any film in history. Made over $400 million worldwide. Once again, with Burton's films, often the case with Burton's films, bigger in the US than overseas. And now we regularly see comic book films perform significantly better overseas, but at the time, that wasn't necessarily the case. And of course, comic books were pretty unknown commodities as far as movie adaptations. Superman had been a massive success, but that was pretty rare at this point. And what else can you say about this film? It rejuvenated the box office after a couple of years of a box office downturn. It, in no small part, began the world we live in now of these comic book adaptations being so ubiquitous. But another thing is that at this point in time, when this film came out, and I saw this movie in the movie theater multiple times, I was in high school, I believe, at this point, and I was already a precocious film fan. So I had already seen Clockwork Orange and then had become a Kubrick fan. I had already seen Taxi Driver and became a Scorsese fan. I, of course, had seen Spielberg's biggest films. I had just seen Aliens in the movie theaters, and of course had seen Terminator on cable 500 times, and was a Cameron fan. So I had my guys. I had David Lynch, right? I had already seen Blue Velvet at this point, believe it or not. I shouldn't have seen Blue Velvet at this point, but I had seen it. And I was already becoming a Lynch fan. And I was even becoming a Cronenberg fan, believe it or not. I had seen The Fly in movie theaters, had caught up on his back catalog of films, and then had seen Dead Ringers just the year before. And so precociously getting into the artsy fartsy type of films that, you know, honestly, a 14-year-old should probably not be watching, but I was getting deep into films. As if you're a hardcore film fan, you probably have a similar biography. But what I find so interesting was that I remember seeing Batman in the movie theaters, even as a film fan. And one of the things that was so exciting about it was that somebody who was so idiosyncratic, someone who was not a generic, by the rules filmmaker, making something that felt like his own, and it was so massively successful. And he became a brand name, basically. At this moment, Tim Burton became a brand name. And what's the most interesting thing about it is listening to recent podcasts where they covered Burton's career and hearing people who are 5 years younger than me, some of these podcasters, 10 years younger than me, 25 years younger than me, and they all have the same story. They saw Batman, and Batman was like a gateway to, oh, that's what a director does. Now, that wasn't my experience because, like I said, I had already seen like Clockwork Orange at this point in 2001. And most people at that age probably don't do that, but I had. But my point is that even with that experience, that knowledge of other filmmakers, I still appreciated the fact that I'm like, oh, see, like he's going to make auteurism mainstream. It brings it to the summer blockbuster. I don't know why that was so eye-opening to me, honestly, because you think about Spielberg, for example. But I think that because, and this is an unsophisticated take, but now I can obviously appreciate what makes Spielberg Spielberg, what makes Cameron Cameron, even though their style is more subtle. Burton's style is so in your face that as soon as you see one frame of the movie, you know you're watching a Tim Burton film. And maybe that's why these young people, generation after generation, gravitate to him as an auteur, because it is so obvious. It's like, this was not made by James Cameron. You watch a James Cameron film for 5 minutes, you watch an action sequence, and this must be Cameron. Look at the geography of this action sequence. This must be Cameron. Look at everything's blue. Why is everything blue? Must be Cameron. But you need to have a little feel for the pacing of the film and the visuals for a little bit. Like I said, Tim Burton, 2 minutes of his films, you're like, well, that's only one person who did this. It was Tim Burton, right? I mean, over time, that became generic. So people copied it so many times that maybe it did become a Instagram filter. But at that moment, he was a one and only. He was a one of one. And he makes this name for himself. Now, in between Batman and Batman Returns, he wants to make Edward Scissorhands. Now, he takes it to Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers doesn't want it, shockingly, honestly, given how much money they've made on his previous projects. And this is, even at the time, obviously a very personal film for Burton. I think this is Burton talking about his experience of growing up in Burbank, California, not in the ritziest part, but in the suburbs where you have your ticky-tacky, all the homes, all the same, candy-colored, and he's this goth kid. He's the outsider, and this is his visual representation of this monochromatic outsider and how he feels in this world. Always sunny, no seasons as he's described it in the past, geography, and how he just felt so alienated. But it's also a sweet film. He has people who love him. He has people who care for him. But there's another metaphor here too. He is already starting to feel, as a creative person, that yes, they will bring you in. The mainstream, the milquetoast Americana culture will embrace you as long as you're making money for them. When they can sell your art, when they can sell your otherness, your uniqueness, to have a little bit of their own cachet, to have an interesting thing to talk about that week. But this wholehearted embrace is a facade. It's a trap in a way. So it is about his young adulthood and possibly even more autobiographical, maybe about a specific relationship that he had at some point. But I think it also spoke to the fact that he is now becoming part of this machine. He's making Batman. He's about to make the Batman sequel. How much of his self does he have to surrender to play in this larger sandbox? And if you haven't seen Edward Scissorhands or haven't seen it in a long time, this is a really beautiful, iconic film, for better and worse. It made Johnny Depp a household name. It's his breakthrough role as a star. He still gives an excellent performance here. He's become, he became eventually a caricature of himself, but at this moment, he's still giving a really interesting performance. And it's just a fairy tale, right? This is very much intentionally designed as a fairy tale and a beautiful film across the board. And for me, maybe still to this day, my favorite Burton film. And honestly, it's probably, if I say to this day, I mean, I don't know, unless he's got an Oppenheimer up his sleeve sometime down in the future. Who knows? Maybe he can make a biographical film about Mario Bava or something like that, that, intersects with the last days of Mussolini. I don't know, but maybe that's in the future somewhere. At this moment, I think that this is probably the tip of the iceberg for him. This is a big hit, by the way. Makes a lot of money in the United States, overseas. Big hit. The iconic T-shirt, the iconic styling of Edward Scissorhands. I'm sure just in merchandise, this thing has made its budget back over the course of its career. Oh, of course, another name we have to throw in here is Danny Elfman, doing the music for most of his films. One of the most popular music composers of the era, and really gets his start here, leaving Oingo Boingo to become this music composer and almost synonymous with Burton's films. He follows that up with the Batman Returns film. That sets a new record for opening weekend. And this film is really controversial. Parents take their kids to go see it. It's the new Batman movie. The kids all want to go see it. It's grim. Penguin is a repugnant, repulsive character. Children are abducted to be murdered. They're not, luckily, but there's violence and ugliness in the film. It is even darker than Batman. I think people forget how dark Batman is, by the way. They acted at the time. I remember this period of time, how people were outraged by this. And I remember seeing it in the theaters at the time And I was disappointed, although even on my first watch, I thought Catwoman was absolutely an incredible character. And Michelle Pfeiffer does such a great job. And by the way, Danny DeVito does a great job as the Penguin. I just did not like having the Penguin character in the film. And then, of course, it came out on cable, and I watched it on, someone gave it to me at Christmas on VHS or something, and I watched it many times after that, and primarily rewatched the Catwoman scenes and the Catwoman Batman scenes, which are so great. Such great chemistry between the two leads. And really did not rewatch the Penguin scenes as much because it was pretty rough. But I do love this film now, but it is really imperfect, as is so much the case with so many of his films. The Penguin character seems almost extraneous. I mean, there are some interesting thematic parallels there with what happened to him as an orphan versus what happened to Bruce Wayne. But it feels like you could have minimized that character somewhat and still achieve some of the same goals. And some of the visuals are beautiful. Some of the action sequences are very well done. But despite all that, it's imperfect. But like I said, the Catwoman-Batman relationship is really fascinating. It really is what makes the film really hold up to this very day. And really, I think if you haven't seen this one in a while, check it out. But it was a little bit of a chink in his armor, although the film still made a fortune at the box office, well over $300 million. And people say, oh, but that was less than the previous Batman movie. But back in those times, believe it or not, sequels almost always underperformed the previous film. So it was not uncommon at all to expect to see that. So it didn't hurt his reputation that much. At this point, he began a relationship with Disney again. So after Disney had not really been able to figure out what to do with him, and then he had transitioned over to Warner Brothers and had been pretty loyally working for Warner Brothers. But then when Warner Brothers rejected his Edward Scissorhands take, he started to shop around to think of maybe he could build a relationship with someone else. And of course, he had already had this relationship with Disney. And the first thing they did together, we have to include it here because it is not directed by him, actually directed by Henry Selick, who also directed Coraline, which just got re-released this year. An incredible movie, beautiful film to see in 3D if you get a chance to still see it in theaters while you can. I'm sure this will become a perennial re-release, the Coraline film, just like this film I'm talking about right now, which is The Nightmare Before Christmas, which is also released practically every year now. And of course, not Tim Burton directing, but Tim Burton wrote the book on which the film is based. And of course, his design aesthetic, because he drew all the pictures as well, are all over this. And once again, you just look at that and you immediately think Tim Burton. You don't think Henry Selick. But he really should get more credit for that, of course. But still, back on topic, Tim Burton has a film that actually slightly underperforms based on what Disney's expectations are. The budget is pretty big for this stop motion, a very painstaking process, obviously, of animation. And the film makes money, but not the kind of money Disney was expecting to make. However, once again, long term, this thing becomes a phenomenon. It gets released over and over again. And you think about just the merchandising on the Jack Skellington character and all the other characters in this film for generations of kids. If there is, and there probably will be someday, a live action version of this, Disney will probably make this as an adaptation at some point with an all-star cast and a $180 million budget for all the special effects. And there are many generations of children who have grown up watching this. So it's probably inevitably going to happen, and it will probably make a fortune. And they probably want Burton to direct it. And that same year, from Disney once again, comes, I think, the end of this incredible run that Burton had at this point. A perfect opening to a career, and a long streak here, by the way. He ends things with Ed Wood, another absolutely beautiful film, almost a sibling to the Edward Scissorhands film, another unlikely creator who's chewed up by the Hollywood system. I think Burton very much looks at Ed Wood, this complete failed cult director, and he thinks, that could have been me. That could have been me. I could have had a flop film or never made a major film or produced these things on my own and been just doing like little stop motion films in my backyard and never had any kind of mainstream success. This film actually does not make much money at all. On paper, it looks like a flop, but it got multiple Academy Award nominations. It got excellent reviews, and it's so well respected. And everybody who's seen this, if you have never seen this film, check it out. I think it's available on Disney Plus and Hulu. Regardless of how it did in theaters, once it was available at home, it found its audience. And for me, this is the end of his hot streak. Now, I know people, 1996 we're up to now, we're talking about Mars Attacks. It's very much him doing an homage to the 1950s sci-fi Martian invasion films, these specific trading cards, by the way, Mars Attacks. But also Dr. Strangelove. We have Jack Nicholson here playing 3 different roles, like Peter Sellers in that film. So it's a mashup of different genres that he's trying to riff on. It's more a satire of those things. It very much feels on paper like it is a very Tim Burton project. But it's the beginning of this very messy concoction. Once again, we'll see this multiple times in his career, where he's kind of putting in 20 different characters, 15 different side plots. And they do, once again, this is kind of going back to Beetlejuice, how all these plot lines start to intersect as the film goes on. But for me, I think the biggest problem I have is I like the design work. I love the design of these Martians. He actually sculpted these things. They're beautiful looking if you ever see them. There's like a traveling museum show of his artwork from his movies. And I love the Martian design, but it's all done with CGI. And CGI is really a barrier for me and him. Some of this is practical. I think if this was all done with puppets, like all had been stop motion, and I think that would have been too expensive, too painstaking. And maybe today, with the special effects that we have now, you could basically make them look like they're stop motion, which is kind of what we see in Beetlejuice, by the way, with the sandworms. Maybe this would work better. It's almost like you need to remaster this and maybe see what it would look like. I would be open to that. I know filmmakers don't like this idea, but if you could go in there and redo all the effects work in this film with modern CGI, not to make it look like polished Avatar level CGI, but to make it look almost like an Art Deco representation of the style of the 50s, I would be open to that. I'd be curious to see what that would look like. So there's some great ideas in this film, but it doesn't work for me, still doesn't work for me, although I do love the design work. I do love the ideas in here, and the film doesn't work. And it didn't work at the box office either. The film cost about $100 million. It only made $100 million. It did not have that kind of cult following that grew over years. Maybe recently it has, but I don't think that they've made much money on this film, if any. They didn't sell toys, which they definitely wanted to do. He did return to Warner Brothers for this. And we start to see at this time that first chink in his armor. Then we see, he follows that up 3 years later with Sleepy Hollow. He reunites with Johnny Depp. He has Christina Ricci here, which seems like a no-brainer for him to work with Christina Ricci. The OG Wednesday Adam, I guess, actually not the OG, but the OG from my generation, Wednesday Addams. This comes out from Paramount. And this works better than Mars Attacks, but this one doesn't really work for me either. The reason I think I like this better is because it is mostly practical. It's stunt work, and it's someone in a suit pretending to be the Headless Horseman, and it's a lot of lighting effects. It's a lot of beautiful Gothic sets. It's very much trying to be in the style of a Hammer movie from the 1950s, another big influence that I haven't called out yet on his filmmaking. He wants to make these type of big sets, folk horror style of those Hammer studio films from the 50s with bright red spatters of blood. So I do like all the aesthetic signposts that he has there. I like a lot of the action here in the film. The action's actually pretty good. I like that our hero here is this cowardly investigator, not the traditional brawny hero. Very much a Edward Scissorhands type character, played by Johnny Depp once again. So there are things I like about the film. It doesn't quite all work for me, but it does work better than Mars Attacks. But for the first time, I start feeling that his aesthetics and the material he's working on, he doesn't have enough of his own ideas to develop all the way through. He's taking these, hey, how about do Sleepy Hollow? Hey, how about do Mars Attack? It feels like he's saying, hey, why don't you try this? And then he brings his ideas to it, but they're not quite fully baked. And I think that seems to be pretty much the rest of his career, unfortunately. To that point, he gets hired to make Planet of the Apes. It's shocking. First of all, shocking that the Planet of the Apes series, which I covered here in a podcast, track down that podcast episode in the backlog if you want to hear my review of that entire 11 movie cycle. This movie is not the complete and utter train wreck that everybody claims it to be, not in my opinion anyway. But what I will say was I was shocked when I saw this in theaters. By the way, I did see it in theaters. Just hiring Wahlberg here as your lead character, an actor that I do find entertaining sometimes, especially in his more comedic roles, but does not seem like the right actor for a Tim Burton film. And to that point, the gorilla makeup effects are absolutely incredible. They're beautiful, all practical, which I do love that aspect of this film. But other than the makeup, there's nothing in here that feels like Burton at all. Like, this is as generic filmmaking as you can get. I was so disappointed to think that this is Burton doing this. He brings nothing of himself to the material, I think. But this is another pattern. This is another pattern you'll see here, that the films that people will berate him the most for are some of his most financially successful. This film made almost $400 million worldwide at the time. Very successful for its budget. But there was such a bad taste left in people's mouths that they never followed this up with a sequel. Of course, the series would continue in a different direction, but it would take years for that to happen again. He followed that up in 2003 with a pretty beautiful film, I think. A film called Big Fish, which has Ewan McGregor reuniting with his father, who always told these big fish stories, the stories that he told about his travels when he was away from him as a boy. And it's really about the repairing of this relationship between this father and this son. This film very much works for me emotionally. I love the design work. It's really beautiful. And I do like the payoff where we start saying that a lot of these stories are made up, but they're all variations on reality. And I think Burton is talking about how stories themselves are this buffer. They make our reality better. And they also allow us to process these traumas of our childhood or our pasts through these stories. This film made money. This film got good reviews, but it didn't get any kind of Academy Award attention. And I think that was really the intention here. So I think this was seen as a bit of a disappointment, but it is one of his better films, by the way, and really one that most people probably haven't watched as part of his retrospective because they don't consider it a Burton film, but it really is very indicative of the back half of his career, for better and worse. But this is the best version of it, I think. He follows that up immediately with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Now, there's a lot of Burton-isms in this. We have Johnny Depp again doing a Michael Jackson impression practically. And we have a lot of the design work that we expect from his type of films. These are on the candy-colored, Technicolor variety versus the goth version of his aesthetics. And I know people hate this film because they love the Gene Wilder film so much. I was never a huge fan of the Gene Wilder film. It's better than this, but it's not like some masterpiece. I think it's overstated how much people love that film. So I was open to a reinterpretation, let's say, and this film is okay, which is a disappointment in that Burton, this should be a slam dunk for Burton, basically, and it's not. It's just okay. And part of that reason, once again, is all the CGI. This is a very expensive film with a lot of CGI. He can do anything that comes to his mind because of the CGI. And in some ways, I think Burton needs to be a little constrained. I think if he had to do this all practically, if he made that his own goal, I'm going to build all these sets and spend the same money, but I'm going to build it all. The story would be more streamlined. The jokes would hit better and less of this CGI gobbledygook. And I'm not anti-CGI, by the way. I think it can work really well in the right circumstances. I love the Avatar films, for example. That's obviously the cream of the crop for that type of thing. But this didn't need to be CGI. And as a matter of fact, once again, we're talking about candy. We're talking about kids in this fantasy world. The more tactile it is, the more fun it would be as a kid's film. So it's not as bad as everybody says, but it should have been a slam dunk for Burton, and it was not even close. But of course, it was another huge box office success. That same year, he also directed a stop motion Corpse Bride film. This is a beautiful, back to his black and white aesthetic. This is actually, not the story's not that great, although it does hit me emotionally by the time we get to the end. But the design work in this film is really beautiful. And you really have a sense of, once again, the more tactile we are with what he's putting on the screen, the better it works. And he follows that up in 2007 with Sweeney Todd. Now this film, another big hit, gets Academy Award nominations. Johnny Depp is not a great singer, but I thought he gave a good performance here. I like this film a lot, and I think that has to do with the fact that I had never seen any production of Sweeney Todd. So maybe if I was a big Sondheim fan and I had heard hundreds of different versions of these iconic performances, I would think that the songs are terrible and the staging is terrible. But for me, it was the first time, other than knowing the concept of Sweeney Todd, it was the first time I'd seen it performed all the way through. I thought this was a very well done screen adaptation. And a lot of that is just the power of the play itself, which is iconic for sure, for a reason. And once again, maybe if I had familiarity with the play beforehand, I would be, or musical, I guess I should say, I would have been less forgiving of this. But for me, as an entry point, I thought it was very good. And I actually love the look of it. It's very stagey, but hey, this is an adaptation of a musical. So it almost feels intentional that we're supposed to feel like we are on a soundstage and this is being performed for us. So all of it works for me. I even like Depp's performance. His singing's not great, but some of the other performers have great singing voices. The music's great, of course. And yeah, this is a really good one and a very grim musical. Shocking that this musical, which is, decades old, many decades old, it really goes for it. It's a pretty grim topic here. And a financial success as well. It made some $150 million or so for this type of film, an impressive box office take. And it's really all downhill from there. In 2010, in the wake of Avatar, just 1 year after Avatar, he makes the Alice in Wonderland film for Disney. This is when they're starting to make live action remakes of all their old classic animations. And I have only seen this film one time. I saw it at a team building event at the company I was working at the time, believe it or not. We went there for lunch. Of course, this was in the wake of Avatar, so we had to see it in 3D. This is post-conversion 3D, not shot in 3D. It looks absolutely atrocious. It looks like everybody is a cutout figurine on a flat surface. It looks absolutely terrible. Post-converted 3D looks absolutely bad. This is why 3D film going in general has gone down the toilet, because people weren't shooting in 3D. They were doing this conversion after the fact. It looks awful. And this film just looks terrible. So and I've never rewatched it. So I know some people like the design work in this film. Some of the actual creature designs, and this is all CGI. Some of it actually looks pretty nice, just purely as design work. But this film, for me, I remember seeing this in theaters and absolutely hating it. And I'm sure that terrible 3D presentation had something to do with it. But I despise this film. And I know so many people who hated it so much in general. I've never gone back to it again. And of course, this is the irony of his entire career. Here's one of the films of his that one of the few that I actually could say I just downright despise. And it made over $1 billion. So there's the success of his films and the quality of his films do not necessarily line up. He followed that up in 2012 with Dark Shadows. Johnny Depp is back. Everyone's getting sick of Johnny Depp at this point, even before he got semi-canceled or before the court case. This film has an incredible prologue that sets up the current state film, the doomed romance of Barnabas. And once again, very much is winked at in Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. Yeah, once again, this is why I keep bringing up the fact that Beetlejuice Beetlejuice feels like a capstone to Burton's career up until this point. There are so many elements of this film that feels like Burton is redoing or trying again to do something that he did successfully before, or maybe failed at before, and is trying to reclaim a bit in this latest film. But even Dark Shadows didn't lose money. Oh, and of course, just to finish off that mini review, the prologue is excellent and beautiful and really, really well done. I remember seeing this in theaters, by the way, with my nephews. Probably totally inappropriate to be seeing this with my nephews at the time. They were very young and didn't realize, it was a Johnny Depp movie. I didn't know if it was going to be that inappropriate. It's very sexual, lots of sex jokes. And once they get to contemporary times, it should be funny that this vampire's out of time and it should work. And it doesn't. It really does not work. Just watch the prologue and then you can skip the rest of the film. That same year, he made another stop motion. He made a feature-length version of Frankenweenie, going all the way back to his short film that in many ways launched his career and extended it to feature length. This is actually pretty good. It's pretty sweet, made in stop motion, whereas the short was actually mostly live action. And it did fine. Once again, this is diminishing returns for his career at this point. Dark Shadows doesn't make any money. It doesn't lose much money either. Frankenweenie makes a little bit of money, but definitely not what Disney was hoping for here. They wanted to have another Nightmare Before Christmas, let's say. Not going to happen here. And then he made the type of movie that I personally think he should have done more of the whole entire way through. He made a low-budget biographical film called Big Eyes, starring Amy Addams and Christoph Waltz. And this is the story of Margaret Keane, who made those famous paintings of the children with the big eyes. Well, actually, her husband was taking credit for it the whole time. And it was this court case that ensued where she proved that she had been the artist the whole entire time. The most outlandish aspects of the court case were not in the movie for some reason. They thought it would be too over the top. And yet the biographical elements are done more fantastically. Seems like the film in general just is not well thought out. And it's unfortunate because I think that if this thing had hit, and it didn't lose money, by the way, it was modestly successful, but if this thing had been a bigger hit, I feel like Burton would have taken more chances on these smaller type of films. This is a $10 million production. So this is him trying to see if he can get more autonomy by working at a smaller scale. And when that doesn't work, he goes and does the book adaptation for Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. And this isn't an absolutely terrible film. There's actually a pretty interesting time travel element to the story, which I wasn't expecting. But there's so much CGI in this film. The ending is absolutely terrible. You'll forget seeing this film as soon as you finish watching it. This is also a series of books. They obviously were hoping to turn this into another YA franchise. It didn't work out, mostly because of the failure of this first film. It's not terrible. Eva Green is here yet again, who is a bit of his goth femme fatale muse, although she's the heroine here in this film. 3 years after that, he went back to Disney to make yet another one of these reimaginings of their classics, Dumbo. Now, I've only seen this film one time. I don't think I've seen it all the way through. I watched it with my daughter. She was very young at the time, and she loved the Dumbo character and loved to watch him fly around. And it's very sweet, the relationship with the mother, that whole aspect of it. So I don't hate this film the way other people do. It's mostly forgettable. It again feels like someone doing an Instagram filter, the Tim Burton Instagram filter, rather than him sincerely vested in the material. I don't hate this movie the way so many other people do. And it didn't lose much money. As a matter of fact, it probably made a little bit of money, but certainly less than other Disney adaptations had done. It has a great cast. You have Eva Green, you have Colin Farrell, you have Michael Keaton again. The special effects are pretty convincing. The elephant's pretty convincing. And maybe it's just my memory of watching this with my daughter. I didn't hate this film at all. But it's not only the fact that people do hate this film. Burton apparently had such a horrible experience of making this film with Disney, something that, once again, I did not pick up on in watching the film. Maybe I need to watch it again with clearer eyes. That he basically no longer wanted to direct. He pretty much wanted to quit. He just was unsatisfied with the experience. And he was rejuvenated to a large extent when they brought him in to direct and produce the Netflix Wednesday Addams series, which he will also be producing and directing elements of, or episodes of, the second series, which is upcoming. But it was the first time he was working in television, and he really did enjoy this, and they gave him a lot of creative freedom, and it re-energized his passion for making films. And my personal opinion, I only ever watched the first 2 episodes of Wednesday. Only watched them because of the phenomenal success of the series. I could not get into it. It was just too much geared for teenage girls, I think. But worse than that for me was that it didn't feel like Tim Burton directing. It felt like Tim Burton. It really did feel, once again, like the Tim Burton Instagram filter. But regardless of my opinion of it, it was an enormous success. And of course, that rejuvenated his interest in making the Beetlejuice film, the sequel, which of course have come out now. And I do hope, like I mentioned, he brings in all these elements. He brought in Wednesday Addams. He brought in the doomed teen romance from that series. He brought in the aesthetics of the original Beetlejuice, and of course, a direct sequel to it. He brought in the flashback Gothic horror films of Sleepy Hollow and the prologue of Dark Shadows to make this elements of that in this film as well. So he's tying in, almost like winking at his entire filmography in this new Beetlejuice film. And I do hope that this is a rejuvenation for him, because other than like this, once again, this almost cliched style, which has become this goth style for a generation, like it's watching like the Black Parade video by My Chemical Romance or something. It's been a generic style for so long for this populist goth styling, which he created, and now has become almost an anchor to his career. I do hope that maybe now he's at a point where he is able to bring some new ideas to his upcoming films. I do not know what his next film is going to be. This film is going to be a very successful film. It'll make $400 or $500 million on a relatively modest budget. So he'll be able to make whatever he wants to make next. He has rarely made a film that's lost money. Even the ones that are not very well respected have made money. So he probably still has carte blanche in Hollywood to make anything he wants. Now, will he find something that he's intrigued by that benefits from his aesthetic choices? I don't know. Remains to be seen. He is still one of the most unique auteurs of this era, and I do hope that he continues to make interesting films. He hasn't made many interesting films in about 10 years now, and even Beetlejuice is fun, but it's still not going to be on his long list of classic films. I mean, you have that first 7-8 film stretch, and then for me, throw Big Fish in there, and that's pretty much it. Corpse Bride, maybe Corpse Bride. That's about it. So he hasn't added anything to that list yet, but I think Beetlejuice at least shows that he has the interest in trying once again. He still has a long career ahead of him, I'm sure, and he's very prolific. He churns out a film every couple of years, so I would expect to see more from him, and probably right after the next season of Wednesday, we'll probably have another Tim Burton film on the way. I have reviews for all of these films, all of his films on Letterboxd, so do follow me there if you don't follow me already. Check the show notes for the link. And I do hope to have another episode out to you later this week. I won't tell you what the topic's going to be because if I don't get around to recording it, I don't want to make promises I can't keep. So this is a long episode because he has had a very long and prolific career, but I hope you enjoyed it. Go check out one of those Burton films. Most of them are available to stream right now, and I'll talk to you soon.